I've opened more than 50 bank accounts in countries all around the world in the last dozen years, and they're almost all more robust or better in some way than those in my home country. But the process of opening an offshore bank account is a little different than what you might be used to. So today, I'm going to tell you my process for opening an offshore bank account. One thing I can tell you is that the process of opening bank accounts in many countries around the world either gets more expensive in terms of how much you need to deposit, or it gets more difficult, or becomes totally impossible every year. And yet, if you have an account, you can often be grandfathered in. So even if you're just building what we call a tunnel, the best time to open an offshore bank account, or more than one, is generally now. The simple answer of how to open an offshore bank account is you're going to fill out some paperwork and either submit that in person at a bank branch in the other country, or some banks allow what's called remote account opening. I'm going to tell you why you may not want to use remote account opening in a moment. But first, let's address the most commonly asked question about banking offshore. Is it legal? And the answer is, in almost every country, yes. Now, some countries like the United States require you to file a disclosure indicating where those bank accounts are and how much money you have in them. And of course, I would always suggest for you to do that. At Nomad Capitalist, we work with a number of different tax attorneys and CPAs who are well-versed in international tax. You want to work with someone like that to make sure you do your disclosures properly, because we're not trying to hide our money here. We're trying to diversify it. Why would you want an offshore bank account? Diversification into other currencies, potentially that you believe may be stronger, or just you want to be diversified. Diversification into more stable banks. If you look at the list of the 50 strongest banks in the world, not many, if any, in the United States. Some are in Canada, some are in Australia, but many people don't have a bank in their country that's actually one of the strongest. And yet you can go to the countries that have the strongest banks, a country like Singapore, and put your money there at a time when banks in the US were failing earlier this year. It's a good thing to have diversification, not just across different banks, but across different geographies, and again, potentially different currencies. Other banks may offer new investment opportunities, access to deals in another part of the world. It may offer higher interest rates on your cash. It may be a springboard for regional investments. Let's say you have a bank account in Dubai. There may be opportunities and an easier way to make real estate investments in that part of the world, for example. And it's a way to have asset protection by not keeping all of your eggs in one basket. So when you're opening an offshore bank account, you want to understand that there are different types of accounts. People oftentimes think they go to the straight, they go to Chase Bank or Commonwealth Bank or TD Bank or whatever bank you have in your country, and you walk in with, let's say, a driver's license, and the account process is done in about 15 minutes. There are a few countries like Georgia, for example, where bank account opening is really fast. Most countries, the process is going to be slower because they don't have access to all the information about you. And the fact that it's not all tied into one system is actually a good thing. But you have retail accounts like you might have in your country where you just want to, put some cash in and use a debit card, for example. You'll have priority accounts, which generally have six-figure minimums. This is what you'll find, for example, in countries like Singapore. This is what they offer to non-residents, where you put in multiple six figures, they'll give you access to a suite of services, not only a retail transactional account, but many banks will offer you 3, 10, 12, 15 different currencies you can swap between, so you can take advantage of holding different currencies. They'll also, in many cases, offer investments. So a bank in Singapore, for example, you can buy into certain kinds of Singapore government debt and earn higher interest rates than you could on bank deposits. You can buy into certain investment funds. Now, there are certain banks where Americans may be restricted from making certain investments, but anyone else can take advantage of certain funds that invest in countries that may be largely inaccessible, or funds that are more locally run than, let's say, an ETF would be on the stock exchange. And then you've got private banks. These are often banks where they expect to manage your money for you, what are called discretionary accounts. These are more investment focused. This is not where you're just going to put some money in and sit on it. They want you to generate a return for the bank by buying products that they sell, which often aren't that appealing, or they want to manage your money by making trades in the stock market or other products that they have to offer. So there's retail, there's priority, and there's private bank. To figure out which one you want, you have to ask yourself, what are your goals? You may have private banks available to you in the country that you live in now. And I think that probably if you're trying to build a portfolio of bank accounts to be fully diversified around the world and take advantage of all the opportunities that are upcoming, is you'd like to have different kinds of accounts. If you don't have a lot of money to start with, you're probably going to be looking at a retail account. If you go to Switzerland, for example, and expect them to give you an account with $1,000, you're not going to be very happy. Now, if you move to Switzerland and you agree to sign up for, let's say, their lump sum tax program where you're going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax a year, perhaps you can get a cantonal bank to open you an account and you don't need to keep a lot of money and you can just use it to pay bills. Obviously, there are people in Switzerland who have low balances in their account. But the difference with offshore banks is that different jurisdictions see themselves in different areas in the pecking order. Name brands like Singapore are going to be more focused on having private banks where they expect to make a lot of money from every account that comes in. And the minimums might be 500,000, a million, $2 million or francs or euros, whatever currency that they deal in. You're not just going to go to some of these countries that have high brand names and that are used to dealing with very wealthy clients and put $1,000. So where can you open a retail account without a lot of money? If you just want to dip a toe in, countries like Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ecuador, Cambodia, these all come to mind as places that take non-residents. That list often gets shorter. For example, in the last year or so, Armenia stopped opening accounts for non-residents. Those are places where you can go and just like, hey, I've got $1. Can I put $1 in? Other countries will allow you to open retail accounts if you have a residence permit there. So that's one reason, in my opinion, that someone who wants to have an offshore bank account wants to actually be more diversified than they think they do. They think they just want a bank account, but in reality, let's say you were to go and get residence in the UAE, Dubai. Can you open an account there's a non-resident at a bank? Sure. It's going to be a bit more difficult in the countries that I mentioned, but it's possible. If you have that residence permit, they're going to be much more likely to open an account for you. Other countries in the Gulf have relatively stable banks as well. So Bahrain, for example, buy real estate, you're required to have a bank account to then get residence. If you own property in a certain country, there's often a case to say, hey, I need a bank account to receive the rent from my property or to pay my local property bills. But if you have some kind of connection to a country, a residence permit, a property, those are extra ways you can diversify your wealth beyond just keeping it in a bank account. And that will often lead to a bank account. But if you're just looking to put $1 in a bank account or $1,000 somewhere, those options are shrinking. But those are four that work pretty well for average people. For me, the sweet spot is that priority banking where you're getting the whole suite of services, but it's designed to be lower fee and more self-service. I've said Singapore to me is the epitome of this. There are plenty of other places like the Bahamas that offer this. Mauritius is a bit more difficult, but they offer this. There's countries in Europe that have these kind of priority services where I don't think the investments have been as exciting, but like Portugal, Czech Republic have offered these. Again, many countries kind of pull back. There were some great banks in Norway up until a couple years ago that would let you go there. Now they don't want non-residents. But priority banking for me is a nice middle point where you have access to investments, you have a relationship manager, you have great online banking at some of these banks. You're looking at anywhere from $50,000 in a smaller jurisdiction up until in the mid six figures in a place like a Singapore. Private banking for me, not a huge fan, because what I found in our business at Nomad Capitalist is we work with a whole network of hundreds of tax experts around the world. And what will frequently help our clients do is uncover unknown unknowns. One unknown unknown for many people is if you're not an American, but you invest in certain U.S. assets and you die, you are subject to U.S. estate tax and you get a very, very minimal exclusion. And so we've seen clients who have certain American assets like a private bank would hold or real estate, and they haven't structured it properly. And so we helped one gentleman save about $2.5 million. It cost him about $15,000 to turn that savings on. He wasn't even aware when he hired us that we were going to find that unknown unknown. And so what I found is these private banks, they talk about, oh, we'll handle your tax, we do this, we're international. It's much more bureaucratic. And quite frankly, when I've asked them questions about things like U.S. situs assets, I've never from one gotten a favorable answer. And as part of my banking portfolio, if you want to get a private bank account in Andorra and only make investments in certain European countries, that could be a way to go. You don't have to worry about them knowing US or UK situs issues. To have one bank who's expected to know everything, I just don't think that's the answer. And I think private bankers often oversell their credentials. Quite frankly, the service times at many of them, particularly Liechtenstein and Switzerland, haven't been that good, haven't been blown away by the attitude. And they're always kind of pegging you like, oh, you think you have 4 million? You think you're special? I have a guy with 80 million, they'll tell you. What's the point of going there to not go where you're treated best? And so I think people are trying to do too many different things with one bank account. You want to figure out what's your goal. So a retail account would be, I just want to put some money in. I want to receive small amounts of money. Maybe I can receive larger amounts of money in the future. Priority bank is more, I'm going to run some of my own investments. Private banking is, let someone else manage it. I'm going to put in big money, and I'm going to accept that they're going to, depending on the jurisdiction, take decent fees, charge me an annual fee, charge me activity fees, etc. And so the portfolio of banks could be, 2 or 3, or it could be 23. Certain things you may not need a bank for. There are brokerage accounts where you can invest in stocks around the world. You'll still need a bank connected to it. And so the diversification and asset protection of having a foreign bank connected to that, or especially, let's say if I would invest in Singaporean stocks, I would rather have a bank where I can buy, Singapore dollars when I want and then transfer them to the brokerage account, rather than having to rely only on the brokerage account, even though some brokerage accounts have very good FX rates. If I'm investing around the world, I might have an account in the UAE for investment in the Middle East, North Africa, etc. I might have a bank account in Singapore for my investments in Asia. I might have a bank account in the US for handling things in Latin America, though the US banks are very domestic focused in many cases. I might have a bank account in a place like Portugal for investing in Europe, or Switzerland, although I think that very much a name brand, Switzerland. And then I might have small, what I've built is retail accounts around the world in places where I have properties, places where I've opened the account over the years. So Montenegro, for example, you could open accounts. You could maybe convince someone in Montenegro to open a retail account for you without living there. If you were to buy a property and get a residence permit there, or buy start a business and get a residence permit there, you could probably get a bank account and you would have 50,000 euros of deposit insurance. I've done that in Serbia, for example. Done that in Armenia. So I have retail accounts in countries where I may have an interest, in places where I can put small amounts of money, and I'll have a wallet of debit cards that I'll take with me at times, and I'll swing through every couple of years and get new debit cards. And in case I ever have a problem, I've got my $10,000 on that debit card. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. What I'll see is you can actually get higher interest rates. I mean, Singaporean banks, Bahamian banks right now have given relatively higher interest rates. Europe is really not there in terms of high interest rates. Georgia used to be very good with interest rates, and they are in their own currency. They're in the double digits. In dollars, they're not. And so figure out how you can maximize the money that you're holding on to. The question is, do I want to open a bank account remotely, or do I want to travel there? Bank accounts that focus on non-residents oftentimes allow a remote account opening, or if they're in traditional offshore centers. So Capital Security Bank at the Cook Islands, for example, I would imagine almost nobody's going to the Cook Islands. You can go to the Cook Islands. They have an office in the Cook Islands. I suppose if you're from New Zealand or Australia, maybe that's feasible. For most people, they're not going to go to the Cook Islands. They are used to opening accounts through correspondence. Banks in the Bahamas, for example, will do that. Banks that are, $1 million deposit will offer that option. If you're doing an immigration procedure in some countries, like in Europe, you can often open accounts through a power of attorney if it's connected to an immigration procedure and you need a bank account. Our attorney in Georgia offers a remote service for people who just want to open a bank account. You will pay a fee for that. You don't need to do immigration. So power of attorney is one way to do remote, where someone's actually going into the bank. Remote accounts, if the bank is not used to doing everything remotely, like in the Cook Islands, for example, it's going to be a lot more paperwork. And so when you I opened an account in Liechtenstein, for example. It was 40 pages of paperwork. They want to know at the private banking level your entire life story. And so for some folks who don't want to go through 40 pages of paperwork, that's one reason just to go to priority banking rather than private, even if you can afford it. To me, that's not a bad thing, because you don't want to have every system connected. The goal is here, have a bit of asset protection. I would suggest going to any bank that allows you to go there, because you'll get a feeling for how it is. You'll feel comfortable. You'll meet people. You look them in the eye, and you'll get to see what some other country looks like and realize that you'll start to close the gap in your mind. But there are certainly banks that don't let you go there. Those are traditionally the offshore banks. Dominica, for example. We'll recommend this to folks if they don't have much money to put in, particularly for a business like an offshore company, British Virgin Islands or something like that account. They might go to a country like Dominica. Generally, if they got more money, we would tell them to go somewhere else. So I don't think you can necessarily go to the banks in Dominica. If you can go there, I would go there. The process will generally be a little bit easier because they can actually see you. They can take a copy of your passport. You can avoid some of the notarization and apostilles, but you'll want to call ahead. Even if you go to banks in Singapore, for example, where they are retail banks, you'll want to have an appointment because you're a non-resident. You'll oftentimes want to send ahead paperwork. There may be certain banks that just don't want you. We don't take Americans, for example, or we don't like people who work in certain industries. I had one bank that said, can you show us your tax returns from a swimming pool business that I invested in and owned back in 2011? And I'm like, I don't know that I have that anymore. I think that, the 7 years has passed. And they said, well, then we're not really interested in upgrading your account. So it's good to have those conversations before you go in. We had a gentleman who has a net worth of probably $400 or $500 million, and he called some of these banks in Singapore, And they really were almost kind of like, maybe not. It was like converting to Judaism almost. Like he had to convince them, 5 times, like he was interested in doing it. When you go there, have an appointment, dress appropriately. Going in board shorts and sandals, particularly in places like Asia, is not going to impress them. You'll go through a process. In a country like Georgia, like a retail account, they will open the account often on the spot. You can go back either later that day, the next day, I've seen up to a week later, and pick up your debit card in person if you want a debit card. That would typically be something that comes to the retail account and with most priority accounts. Some of the private bank accounts have very bad online banking. Like in Liechtenstein, for example, they may not come with debit cards in all cases. So if you want that debit card, that would be retail, and you may want to plan to stay there for a little while, even if the account opening takes place in the first day. Other banks that are more priority, they may take a couple days to review it, which is why it's good to send them stuff ahead of time, build that relationship. Private, it may take a little while, as much as I've seen 4 to 6 weeks for them to open it. If it's a business account, which we really haven't focused as much on in this episode, that may take even more time. You'll need more corporate paperwork. This is largely for personal accounts. And once they're open, eventually you'll get an account number. In some cases, and this may be important if you have to report your account, you may get multiple account numbers for, let's say, different currencies. You can then send money in through a wire transfer. You can use a service like Wise or another currency service that does a book, balance, where they take your US dollars, for example, from your US account. They give you a better rate, and they convert those into Singapore dollars in a Singapore account. Generally, a priority bank will give you better rates than Wise once you get it set up. So if you can send dollars in and convert them in a priority or private bank, that may be better. Ask the banker. If you're opening a small account, you can just deposit cash. I opened an account in Singapore many, many years ago. I just took $1,000 out of the ATM and put it in. If you go to Georgia, they have ATMs that dispense dollars and lari and sometimes euros. And you could just take money out and say, hey, can I put in $100? And then you could always wire money in later. I like the idea of having tunnels. And so that's one reason why I like going to these countries. You may trust Singapore, but I think the more you go to the country, the more you will see, hey, this seems pretty legit. And you'll be more comfortable sending money in. Having a tunnel means you put in the minimum account or some smaller amount now, but you can always send more money in. I've had bank accounts that you open with, $1,000, and then later you say, okay, the deposit insurance limit is $100,000. I will just, I'll send the rest of that money because I'm looking for a place to put some cash. And I would like, I don't want to put all my money in one bank. You don't want to have one bank. We saw that during the banking crisis in 2023 in the US. But you want to understand that banks offshore are going to be more sensitive. Especially if they don't need your money, which, by the way, is a good thing. Like banks in Hong Kong actively turn away people almost all the time. I managed to get an account there once, but they're very conservative. They don't make a lot of risky loans, and therefore they don't need lots of depositors. They're very particular. That's a benefit. They're not just out doing crazy stuff with your money, but you're going to want to act accordingly. It's not going to be open the same day, again, except for some of those retail accounts. But if you're getting into the priority and private accounts, call ahead, have a relationship. That's sometimes hard to establish. In Switzerland, sometimes they're combative, quite frankly. Not all of them, but then when you go there, sometimes they drag it out. So I think that, Europe is going to be a slower, more expensive experience. I do like places like in Singapore. And again, look at this as a holistic project. Where can I have a residence permit? Where can I get a citizenship? Where can I buy property? Those are other ways to diversify and to protect yourself, to protect your wealth. And if you do those things, you'll expand the chances of opening an offshore bank account. And so that's what we help people with at Nomad Capitalist. Having a bank account and having those things would generally be called a plan B. You're not planning on leaving your country. You're not talking about moving to reduce your taxes. You're just talking about having a number of diversified things around the world. And so we help people figure out, okay, where's a good place to have a second citizenship? Where's a place to have a second residence or have a home? How do those things work together? You don't want to have everything in one place, but certainly if you can get a residence and then that allows you to have a bank account that you couldn't open as a non-resident, that's a good thing. You can go to nomadcapitalist.com and learn how we help people. We are not in the a la carte bank account opening business because, quite frankly, we might say, hey, here's 3 banks in a certain country that we think 1 or maybe 2 will work. Let's try them all. And so anyone who's just saying, hey, for $1,000, I'll open a bank account. Yes, our lawyer in Georgia will do that. It's pretty consistent that they can open bank accounts for people in Georgia. But once you get out into the broader world, there are going to be some banks that just don't like your particular profile. And so we help understand your profile when you come to us. We're not 100% right, but generally speaking, we have enough banks in our network that we can find you an account or accounts that matches your criteria. But with that, it's generally a good idea to have other accoutrements of diversification. You can learn more about that service at nomadcapitalist.com.